Power is often misunderstood as something that belongs exclusively to one individual or to one nation, as though dominance can exist in a vacuum, untouched by the shifting forces of the world around it. But this is an illusion. No person, no community, no country exists in isolation. The moment you begin to think you can act without consequence, you are already sowing the seeds of your downfall. Nations are not islands suspended in space. They are nodes in a vast, interconnected network of relationships. To believe otherwise is to embrace a dangerous kind of arrogance, a blindness that history has punished repeatedly. Trump, like any leader, faces this truth whether he wishes to or not. To pretend the United States can act tough on India without repercussions is to deny the very structure of international order. Just as in your own life, when you imagine you don't need friends, mentors, or allies, the illusion of independence leads directly to fragility. Think about your own existence. Every single breath you take is dependent on ecosystems you can't see, on plants thousands of miles away, on oceans that regulate the air and temperature of the planet. Your very capacity to stand here and imagine yourself independent is already built on interdependence. And yet we tell ourselves the story that strength comes from isolation. It's a seductive myth, but it's false. The United States once lived in that illusion that it could dictate terms unilaterally, shape the world with its sheer will. But the world has changed. India has emerged not as a minor player, but as a force that no rational actor can ignore. In recognizing this, Trump is forced to accept that power is not a one-way street. It is reciprocal, conditional, and negotiated, like every meaningful relationship you will ever have. What happens in politics mirrors what happens in your psychological life. When you act as though you are an isolated sovereign, answerable to no one, you inevitably generate chaos. If you dismiss your friends, if you ignore your family, if you believe you can climb upward while scorning everyone beneath you, then sooner or later, you fall. Nations follow the same rule. America cannot afford to act as though India is disposable, because India is no longer a minor power waiting for approval. It is an economic engine, a military presence, a cultural giant. Trump, who thrives on the performance of dominance, must confront the paradox. To remain powerful, he must restrain the urge to dominate. This is not weakness, it is recognition of reality, and reality is the harshest teacher of all. Consider the psychological dimension of dominance. Every tyrant in history has believed in his ability to impose control without compromise, but the record is written in ruins and blood. The Soviet Union collapsed under the weight of its refusal to admit interdependence with the rest of the world. Empires crumble when they cling to the illusion of self-sufficiency. The same logic applies to individuals who isolate themselves in pride or self-deception. You may tell yourself you don't need anyone, but your life will begin to unravel at the seams, because the very fabric of human meaning is woven through relationship. Trump's reluctance to be tough on India reflects this lesson. It is not merely political calculus. It is survival in a system where every action reverberates globally. America cannot strike without also being struck. Now, interdependence does not mean weakness. That's the mistake many make. They think that if you acknowledge your need for others, you're confessing vulnerability, and that vulnerability is defeat. But vulnerability is also the condition for growth. In every genuine relationship, you admit that the other person matters, that you are incomplete without them. In international politics, it works the same way. The United States gains strength not by pretending India is irrelevant, but by recognizing India's importance and building with it. Trump, despite his image of toughness, is cornered by this fact. He cannot afford to alienate India, because the price of doing so would weaken the very foundations he depends on. That's the paradox of power. To be strong, you must accept that you cannot stand alone. This recognition requires humility. And humility is not a trait commonly associated with those who seek power. Yet it is humility that sustains genuine strength over the long term. If you look at the relationships that endure, the friendships that last, the families that flourish, what you find is not dominance and arrogance but cooperation, respect, and interdependence. Nations that thrive learn the same principle. America's posture toward India has shifted not simply because of politics, but because the cost of arrogance has become too great. If Trump were to impose harshness without restraint, he would find America isolated, its influence diminished, its credibility questioned. Interdependence is not optional anymore. It is the structure of the world, and to ignore that structure is to court destruction. The interesting thing about power is that it reveals character. When you have the ability to dominate, what do? Do you crush those weaker than you, or do you build alliances that strengthen everyone involved? That choice determines the sustainability of your strength. The bully always collapses eventually, because no one willingly follows a tyrant forever. But the leader who builds trust and respects interdependence creates a network that supports him when the storm comes. This is why Trump cannot afford to be tough on India. He knows, even if unconsciously, that to attack or undermine India would trigger consequences beyond his control. And in that recognition is a truth that applies universally. Your power is magnified, not diminished, when you treat others as indispensable. Imagine your own ambitions. You want to succeed, to rise, to make your mark in the world. If you pursue that path believing you can bulldoze everyone in your way, you might achieve temporary victories, but the foundation will crack. Because people remember how you treated them. They remember if you dismissed their value, if you acted as though you didn't need them. Eventually, the bridges you burned leave you stranded, unable to move forward. Nations burn bridges too, and America knows this. That's why Trump hesitates. It's not sentimentality, it's survival. You can't wage war against those you will later need as partners. You can't alienate the very people who hold the keys to the future you hope to inhabit. So when we say power is interdependent, we are speaking of something deeper than politics. We are pointing to the very structure of reality. Everything that exists is connected. You eat because someone grew the food. You speak a language because thousands of years of culture developed it. You have opportunities because others sacrificed to create them. To pretend you are an island is not just arrogance, it is ignorance of the highest order. Nations cannot escape this, and neither can individuals. The question is whether you will acknowledge it voluntarily, or whether reality will force the lesson upon you through collapse and chaos. Trump, for all his bravado, cannot escape this truth. America cannot afford to pretend India doesn't matter, and you cannot afford to live as though you don't need others. When you look at the trajectory of nations, one of the most striking realities is how demographics shape destiny. A country's youth is not merely a statistic, it's an indication of energy, of possibility, of an unfolding potential that has yet to be realized. India, more than almost any other nation, embodies this principle today. It is a country where the median age is under 30, where millions are entering the workforce every year, where dreams are colliding with opportunity at an unprecedented scale. This is not trivial. This is the heartbeat of the future. A nation with such a massive pool of young people carries with it the energy of change, innovation, and transformation. If you fail to recognize that, you blind yourself to the forces that will define the world of tomorrow. Trump cannot afford that blindness, because the cost of ignoring India's demographic engine is too high. Now, demographics alone are not destiny, but they are the soil from which destiny grows. What matters is what that youthful energy is directed toward, and in India's case, it is being directed toward technology, entrepreneurship, and the global economy. Think about the sheer number of engineers, programmers, and innovators coming out of India each year. These are not idle hands waiting for direction. They are minds already shaping the digital infrastructure of the 21st century. They are building the platforms, the apps, the solutions that will affect how billions of people live and work. This is why India is not simply a large country, it is a future-oriented force. If Trump were to be unnecessarily harsh toward India, he would alienate the very nation producing the technologies that America itself will rely upon. And this is not weakness on America's part to admit. It is recognition of reality. What's important to understand here is that innovation is not evenly distributed across the globe. It tends to cluster in regions where youth, ambition, and opportunity intersect. Silicon Valley was once such a place for the United States, but increasingly, we are seeing those clusters emerge in India as well. Cities like Bangalore and Hyderabad are becoming synonymous with technological advancement and entrepreneurial vigor. This shift means that if you want to stay relevant in the global economy, you must be in conversation with these hubs. Trump, for all his emphasis on America first, cannot pretend that America can dominate the technological future without India's partnership. The danger of arrogance here is immense, because if you alienate the innovators of tomorrow, you are effectively cutting yourself off from the very engines of progress. And without progress, strength decays quickly. In your own life, the lesson is just as profound. If you refuse to adapt to the future, if you cling to outdated modes of thinking and operating, you will be left behind. Imagine a worker who refuses to learn new skills because he is too proud or too afraid. He may manage to survive for a while, but eventually the ground will shift under his feet, and he will find himself obsolete. Nations face the same risk. The United States must adapt to the fact that India is no longer a peripheral actor, but a central one. Trump cannot afford to posture toughness at the expense of cooperation, because that would amount to rejecting the very future he must inhabit. To survive, you align yourself with the energy of what is emerging, not with the decay of what is passing away. That is as true for individuals as it is for empires. India represents not just a youthful population, but a mindset of ambition. You see it in the way families prioritize education, in the determination of students who often work day and night to secure opportunities, in the resilience of entrepreneurs who thrive despite limited resources. This cultural energy is not easily dismissed. It's contagious. It spreads outward, affecting markets, shaping global narratives, redefining what is possible. And Trump, who thrives on the idea of winning, understands that to turn against India would mean turning against an ally that is already winning in domains that matter most for the future. It's a recognition that the future belongs to those who harness ambition and discipline, not to those who cling to fading glories. America cannot afford to miscalculate here, because India is not slowing down, it is accelerating, and the pace will only increase. There's another element to consider: scale. When innovation meets scale, revolutions occur. India is not merely producing new ideas, it is testing them in one of the largest markets in the world. 1 billion people means 1 billion problems to solve, 1 billion opportunities to explore, 1 billion chances to experiment with new technologies. What works in India can often work anywhere, because the scale of the challenge forces resilience and adaptability. This is why so many global companies now look to India not just as a market, but as a laboratory of the future. If Trump were to antagonize India, he would risk excluding America from participating in this grand experiment. And exclusion from the laboratory of the future means irrelevance, because the world is moving towards solutions that will emerge from these very crucibles of innovation. The paradox of strength is that you must constantly align yourself with what is vital and growing. If you align with decay, you weaken yourself, no matter how much power you believe you wield in the present. Think of an old tree. It may stand tall, appearing powerful, but if its roots no longer draw nourishment from the soil, it begins to rot from within. The same is true for nations that refuse to draw nourishment from the energy of youth and innovation. Trump, for all his rhetoric about toughness, faces the undeniable fact that America cannot thrive without linking itself to India's vitality. The choice is clear: recognize India's role as a partner in shaping the future, or risk isolation in a world that is rapidly evolving beyond unilateral dominance. From a psychological perspective, the refusal to adapt is often rooted in fear. People cling to what is known, even when it no longer works, because stepping into the unknown feels dangerous. But the unknown is also where growth occurs. India represents the unknown for America in some ways, a partner rising quickly, a force that cannot be controlled in the old ways of dominance. For Trump, admitting the necessity of cooperation with India might feel like a compromise, but in reality, it is an opportunity. To resist, that is to let fear dictate action. To embrace it is to allow courage to shape destiny. And courage, in this context, means recognizing that the future belongs to those willing to partner with the forces of growth rather than resist them. When you look at the arc of history, you see this pattern repeat itself endlessly. Those who aligned with the emerging powers, with the engines of progress, survived and thrived. Those who resisted, who tried to hold onto outdated dominance, collapsed into irrelevance. It's a brutal truth, but a liberating one as well, because it tells you that survival is not about clinging to the past, but about investing in the future. India is the future. It is the demographic giant, the technological powerhouse, the entrepreneurial force of the coming century. Trump cannot afford to ignore this, and neither can America. And in your own life, you cannot afford to ignore the future either. You must decide whether you will cling to your own fading comforts or step boldly into the energy of what is to come. When you examine the relationship between America and India, it is not only about economics or military strategy, though those are significant. At the deepest level, it is about shared values, about the stories that both nations tell themselves about who they are and why they matter. India, despite its complexities, is the world's largest democracy. That fact alone binds it to the United States in ways that cannot be dismissed casually. Trump, for all his bluster about toughness and dominance, understands that turning against India is not just turning against a market or a power, but against an idea. The idea that democracy, however messy, is a path to freedom and flourishing. If he were to be overly harsh, he would risk undermining the very identity America has claimed for itself. Because nations, like individuals, live out stories, and stories are fragile things. A story is not merely an arrangement of words. It is the framework by which people make sense of their existence, by which they understand their suffering, their triumphs, and their sacrifices. For America, the story has long been about freedom, self-determination, and democratic ideals. India, despite its differences, resonates with that story. To be in alliance with India is to affirm the American narrative. To oppose India, however, is to create a crack in that very narrative. Trump thrives on stories. His entire political style is built on casting himself as the hero in a grand battle. But heroes must have allies, and those allies must share the moral universe of the tale. This is why the bond between America and India goes beyond transactions. It is ideological, rooted in shared democratic aspirations that define not only politics, but the meaning of national identity itself. When nations align on values, it strengthens both sides in ways that cannot be measured by trade balances or military contracts alone. It creates legitimacy, it creates moral authority, and in a world where narratives are as powerful as weapons, moral authority is not something that can be squandered lightly. Trump is often accused of being pragmatic to the point of cynicism, yet even he cannot ignore the symbolic weight of India. To be tough on India in a reckless way would be to betray America's own identity, because you cannot preach democracy to the world while punishing one of the few nations that embodies it on such a massive scale. That contradiction would not only weaken America's influence abroad, it would corrode its story from within. And when your story collapses, so does your power. Consider the psychological dimension of values. As an individual, if you betray your own principles, you fracture your identity. You become divided against yourself, and the consequence is chaos. Nations face the same reality. If America insists on promoting freedom while undermining a democratic ally, it fractures its own self-concept. Trump knows this, consciously or not, and it constrains him. His rhetoric may be forceful, but his actions are tempered by the need to preserve consistency between America's identity and its behavior. In your own life, the same principle applies. You cannot claim to value honesty while lying constantly, or claim to value loyalty while betraying those closest to you. The contradiction will eat you alive. To live coherently, your values must align with your actions, or you will collapse under the weight of your own hypocrisy. There is also the question of alliances. Values serve as the glue that binds nations together, just as shared beliefs bind individuals into friendships, marriages, or communities. You do not remain loyal to someone because it is profitable every single day. You remain loyal because you recognize that the shared values make the relationship meaningful, sustainable, and trustworthy. America and India are bound by this glue, and Trump, regardless of his style, is constrained by it. He cannot afford to alienate India, because doing so would unravel a network of alliances that depend on value-based trust. It would signal to the world that America's talk of democracy is mere rhetoric, empty of substance. And once that perception takes root, it becomes nearly impossible to restore credibility, because credibility is built slowly but lost in an instant. At the cultural level, India represents something deeply symbolic to the American imagination. It is not only a partner but a mirror, showing what democracy looks like in a radically different context. The challenges India faces, poverty, diversity, conflict, make its democratic experiment extraordinary in scale and complexity. By aligning with India, America aligns with resilience, with the belief that democracy can survive even in the harshest of conditions. For Trump to attack India harshly would be to signal that America does not truly believe in the resilience of its own ideals. It would mean that democracy is only valued when it is easy, neat, and perfectly aligned with American preferences. That is not a sustainable position. Real values must endure under pressure, and partnerships with nations like India test whether America's values are more than words. The recognition of shared values also strengthens the narrative Trump wants to project domestically. His supporters want to believe that America stands strong not just as an economic or military force, but as a moral force. That requires visible allies who reflect those ideals. India, despite its imperfections, fulfills that role. It provides evidence that democracy is not merely an American invention, but a global possibility. For Trump to undermine India would be to weaken his own narrative of American greatness, because greatness requires allies who embody the same ideals. You cannot be great alone, because greatness is measured in relation to others. It is measured in the alliances you build, in the values you defend, and in the legacy you leave behind. To discard India would be to discard part of that legacy. At the psychological core, human beings crave coherence. We want our actions to make sense, our values to align with our choices, and our stories to be internally consistent. Nations are no different. America's coherence depends on aligning with countries that reflect its stated identity. India is one of those countries. Trump, however instinctively aggressive he may be, cannot afford to create dissonance between America's values and its behavior. Because dissonance, once created, spreads like a virus. It erodes trust, it destabilizes alliances, and it weakens influence. In your own life, think of the times when your actions contradicted your beliefs. The guilt, the confusion, the frustration. It destabilizes you. And until you realign, you remain fractured, unable to stand firmly. That is exactly what America risks if it abandons its value-based alignment with India. This is why ideological alignment matters more than people think. It is not just about grand speeches or symbolic gestures. It is about survival. If a nation betrays its values, it loses the moral ground on which all its power rests. Trump, whether he admits it or not, is constrained by this truth. India is not merely an ally of convenience, it is an ally of conviction. And to fracture that bond would be to fracture the very story America tells the world, and more importantly, the story it tells itself. And without a coherent story, neither individuals nor nations can survive, because chaos and contradiction always consume what is weak. The temptation of power is always arrogance. The belief that because you hold authority, you can act without restraint, without compromise, without humility. Leaders fall into this delusion repeatedly, convinced that toughness is the same thing as strength. But toughness without wisdom is brittle. It shatters the moment it encounters resistance greater than expected. This is why Trump cannot afford to be recklessly tough on India. He may want to posture dominance, but the risks are too high. Arrogance here would not display strength, it would expose weakness. To navigate this, he must embrace humility, not as defeat, but as strategic survival. Humility, in the face of power, is not easy. It feels unnatural, especially for leaders who are celebrated for their boldness and confidence. Yet, history is filled with examples of those who refused humility and paid the price. Empires collapse because leaders overestimated their control and underestimated the necessity of restraint. When a nation as significant as India stands in front of you, pretending you can act unilaterally is delusion. For Trump, this is a pivotal recognition. He cannot treat India as though it is disposable because India is too consequential. Humility is the only option that allows strength to endure without crumbling under its own arrogance. We can draw parallels with individual life. Think of a person who refuses to admit they need help. They walk through the world pretending they can carry everything alone. But the weight grows heavier, the cracks appear, and soon they collapse under burdens that could have been shared. Nations face this same law. America cannot carry its global ambitions while pretending it does not need India. Trump cannot afford the illusion of total independence. Just as individuals are strongest when they admit interdependence, nations are most resilient when they practice humility in choosing allies wisely. Without humility, strength turns to fragility in disguise. Strategic humility does not mean weakness. It does not mean surrender. It means recognizing the boundaries of one's power and adjusting accordingly. A wise general does not march into every battle simply to prove courage. He chooses his battles with care, understanding that sometimes restraint is the greater form of strength. Trump, despite his image, is forced into this position with India. To attack recklessly would drain resources, isolate allies, and destabilize the very structure America depends upon. Humility here is not cowardice but prudence. It acknowledges that power exists within a web of consequences that arrogance cannot ignore. At the psychological level, humility is the antidote to pride. Pride blinds you to reality. Humility sharpens your vision. Pride says, I can act however I wish. Humility says, I must act in alignment with truth. For Trump, the truth is that India is too large, too innovative, too strategically significant to antagonize without destruction. To accept this is to see clearly. To deny it is to walk into chaos, and in your own life, the same principle holds. When you recognize your limitations, you become stronger. When you deny them, you set yourself up for collapse. Humility is not weakness. It is clarity. Consider what happens when arrogance dominates decision-making. Relationships crumble, trust evaporates, and enemies multiply. The arrogant individual isolates himself until no one remains to stand with him when the storm comes. Nations, too, can isolate themselves through arrogance, alienating potential allies until they are surrounded by hostility. Trump cannot afford that outcome with India. America needs partners to maintain its influence, and India is among the most important. Humility here ensures survival. It preserves relationships that arrogance would destroy, and it transforms potential conflict into cooperative strength that benefits both sides. Humility also requires courage. It is easy to be arrogant because arrogance is fueled by ego and fear disguised as strength. It is much harder to bow when necessary, to admit that another has grown in importance, to accept that the world no longer revolves around you. Trump's political persona is built on projecting dominance, yet reality constrains him. To remain powerful, he must restrain himself. And that is a lesson every individual must learn, to know when to push forward and when to yield, to recognize that bending at the right moment prevents breaking when pressure becomes unbearable. That is the wisdom of humility. There is a paradox at the heart of humility. The more you practice it, the stronger you become. Because humility invites cooperation, and cooperation multiplies strength in ways isolation cannot. A nation that humbles itself to acknowledge another's importance gains allies, stability, and endurance. An individual who humbles himself to learn, to listen, to grow, gains wisdom and resilience. Trump's humility toward India, whether deliberate or forced, reflects this paradox. It allows America to maintain strength not through dominance, but through collaboration, and collaboration is the true engine of enduring power in both personal and political life. Think about the structure of survival itself. In nature, the organisms that endure are not always the strongest in raw power, but the most adaptable. Adaptability requires humility, because it begins with recognizing what cannot be controlled. If America pretends it can dictate terms to India, it ignores reality and risks collapse. If Trump pretends toughness alone will secure America's position, he plays a dangerous game. But if he embraces humility, he allows adaptation. He allows America to remain flexible, cooperative, and relevant in a shifting world. The same principle governs your own survival. Adapt with humility or perish with pride. At the end of it, humility becomes a discipline, a constant check against arrogance, a reminder that no matter how powerful you appear, you are always dependent on forces beyond yourself. For Trump, those forces include India's demographic engine, its technological rise, its geopolitical weight. For you, those forces might be your family, your community, your friends, your mentors. The temptation to dismiss them is always there, but it is a temptation that leads to ruin. Real power, sustainable power, is found not in standing alone, but in standing humbly with those you need and who need you in return. That is the lesson Trump cannot escape.